You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your enlisted host, Abraham.
And I'm your veteran host, Shane.
We are a psychology podcast in the trenches, and we usually talk about psychology things, the things that people do, that animals do, and mathematical models and diagnoses and all kinds of fun stuff. And sometimes we talk about policies that governments put in place that just not only don't work, but sometimes backfire significantly.
Yeah.
And that is our topic for today in our continued and ongoing suite of episodes on addiction, both in substances and behavioral addictions. And today, more substances than anything.
And sometimes we like to do a little bit of history, and history is always fun. And I think this one's got a lot of nice, fun historical things going on in it. And today we are talking about the war on drugs. If you are our age, then you are probably familiar with that term. Many of us have signed our DARE contracts and violated them time and time again. But it is one of those things, as we start talking about this, you're going to see how impactful the war on drugs has been on our culture today in not great ways. We're going to spend some time on that.
And people may have heard like war on drugs, war on poverty, war on crime. There's like all kinds of wars that the government has since waged on various hypothetical entities that aren't actually entities.
Yeah.
And none of which I think have really worked. But to go back to something you said sometimes we talk about history. I would actually argue, and I've been thinking about this for a while now, that I think you could make the case that we're almost more of a history podcast than anything.
Yeah, we spend a lot of time talking about it, yeah.
We do. And the reason that I think that makes sense for what we do is because when we talk about why we do what we do, it's rooted in historical context, right? So we unpack essentially how we got here, and that usually is all it takes. It's just understanding what were the variables that got us to this point, and then we're like, well, that's why. Okay, bye.
Oh. Are we rebranding as a history podcast?
I think we've always been one, and we've just never really admitted it.
Oh, yeah, I guess that's fair. I think, yeah. Oh, man, you just blew my mind. Okay. All right. I'll reconcile that as we talk more. I got into this for the psychology, not the history, but here we are.
I'm going to have to revise my opening statement of we're a historical psychology podcast.
I love it. I love it.
Anyway, if you're listening to this on the day that it publishes, well, thank you for joining us. We're happy to have you here, and it is April 17th, probably, or some other day that you're listening to it, but the time that we're intending this to be available is April 17th, and that is Banana Day.
Haha, and it's also Bat Appreciation Day. Apparently, there's a lot of bat stuff going on this month.
Wasn't that last week?
No, that was Bat Appreciation Week.
They get a week and a day? I mean, I love bats, but...
yeah, in April. Bats rule, but what's going on here? I mean, I wonder if this was a response to COVID. Like everybody's like, no, don't blame the bats. The bats were fine. It was the people eating the bats that caused the problem.
Keep talking about the bats. Well, relatedly, it's blah, blah, blah week.
Uh-huh. It's also Ellis Island Family History Day.
Oh, that's a really good one, actually.
Yeah.
I kind of almost want to spend some time just on that. I wonder, we might need to revisit Ellis Island Family History Day at some point in the future because
yes.
Ellis Island apparently is closed now, metaphorically speaking. Not literally. I think you can still go there. Anyway, it is Herbalist Day.
Yes, it is. It's also National Bookmobile Day. I love mobile books.
It is National Cheese Ball Day, I found out.
Oh, yeah, it is. Yes. It's also National Kickball Day, which is always a blast.
It is International Haiku Poetry Day.
Oh, what is 575?
That's right.
Or 3575 or 57975, however you write haiku. It's School Librarian Day, so be kind. I always think back to Miss Sperber, who was my elementary school librarian, and she was wonderful.
It is World Hemophilia Day, for those vampires out there, I guess.
For the ones who are afraid of blood?
Yeah.
No, that would be hemophobia.
Yeah.
No, that would be hemophobia.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. Could you imagine a vampire who's afraid of blood?
That would be a rough existence.
Yeah, Dracula's like, oh no, not the blood again. It's Astronomy Week.
Ooh.
Go look at the stars.
It is National Green Week.
It is. And it is also Undergraduate Research Week, which means not just relying on YouTube for your research.
Indeed. And one more I found that I definitely think is worth highlighting is that it is Animal Cruelty and Human Violence Awareness Week.
Yes.
Don't be cruel to people or animals.
Yeah, be kind.
Yes.
Be kind to all living things.
Pretty low-hanging fruits type of ask. Anyway, we like to read off the days just as a sort of a fun, trivial celebration and acknowledgement of all the weird stuff that we like to think about and do and say, and sometimes the really important causes that people have championed and assigned a particular date to them. But, as I said, we're going back in history because we're exploring this very bizarre concept about the war on drugs. And before we get started on that, I would just like to say, if you'd like to support the show, you can join us on Patreon. You can pick up some merch, leave us a rating and review, subscribe, tell a friend, or end a war and call it Why We Don't Do What We Don't Do in War, and give us some credit for that.
Yeah.
But we'll talk more about the ways you can support us at the end of today's discussion. What, Shane, was the war on drugs?
So the war on drugs is actually not a war. It was a set of federal policies that focused on combating the production, distribution, and consumption of drugs that had been made illegal. This was a global campaign, actually, so it wasn't just a United States thing. It was a global campaign that included the United Nations and various governments.
The aim of this war, as you might figure this out just from the name, but it was to directly tackle drug-related issues that included production, trafficking, dealing, and use of drugs. Resources were created, allocated, reallocated, and put into efforts to try and reduce the negative impacts of drugs on communities. That's being charitable, I think, but that was more or less the stated intention of the policies.
Yeah, what was said and what was done are two very different things, and you're gonna see that it gets real dark along this path. Now, parts of the war on drugs were also set up to help reallocate resources back into communities that were ravaged by drug-related crimes. So you'll see that some monies that were collected or properties and resources that were repossessed as part of the war on drugs tended to go back to, or at least ideally went back to the communities to help rebuild those communities in those spaces. But it doesn't really work like that, and you're going to see the problem.
You know, we haven't actually given a sort of trigger warning at the top of any of these addiction type episodes, and it's possible that we should have been doing this all along. But I would like to say, trigger warning for this one, we're going to be discussing not only the use of illicit drugs, not favorably necessarily, but we're also going to be talking about harm that has happened to people, and I think some other particularly difficult to handle topics, including things like racism and classism and elitism and bigotry and all kinds of bad things happening. As you said, this does get a little bit dark, so if you're sensitive to those topics, this might not be one that you want to try and sit through, but if you can handle it, then be prepared for the darkness, and let's do a pre-war breakdown.
One of the questions we had to ask as we were talking about the war on drugs is how we even got here. And prior to the start of this quote unquote war, unregulated drug use became a rampant issue in the United States, many, many years before. Now, that being said, drug use has existed since humans have discovered that plants make us feel a certain way, right? So
Yes,
this is not a new thing.
True.
But what started to happen was when more powerful drugs started to get developed and misuse started to kind of become more prevalent, this idea of a kind of like a problem started to emerge, a societal problem. So what ended up happening was morphine began to rise, the use of it. That actually led to the development of heroin, right? So morphine was started to be of use in certain circles. Then heroin started to kind of develop out of that. And the U.S. actually saw a rise in reported addiction to heroin following the Civil War, where many wounded soldiers were given opiates to treat battlefield wounds, and they would come bring that home and they would start using it pretty regularly.
To be fair, also, a lot of prescription drugs like morphine had a very similar effect. They had a high potential for abuse, and cocaine was pretty readily available at this time as well.
Right.
And I think that it was not considered in the scope of the government's responsibility to manage that sort of thing, and that people were sort of given carte blanche to, if they were called medical professionals, administer those as needed, as requested. And sometimes that was like, my wife is being hysterical, please prescribe something for her. And so then they would be basically poisoning them with high amounts of opiates and sedatives. There would be people, as you said, who would have traumatic injuries from war that would become addicted to painkiller type opiates. So anyway, the opiates began to spread into standard practice, with physicians using opiates to treat chronic pain. They would use them on irritable babies. You got a crying baby, give them some really hardcore drugs. It was used for asthma, bronchitis, insomnia, nervousness, hysteria, menstrual cramps, morning sickness, GI issues, and even the vapors.
The vapors, the consumption. Every time I think of like Civil War era, I can't think of anything other than the accent that Val Kilmer does in Tombstone when he's Doc Holliday. He's like, it's the vapors. I'll be your Huckleberry. Now, here's the thing. At the time, most of what was prescribed was a drug called laudanum, which was a powdered opiate concoction and could be purchased over the counter. You could just go buy heroin over the counter. And heroin is also available in cough syrup form. And then cocaine started showing up as an anesthetic as well. So it was used in a lot of medical spaces and these pretty powerful drugs. And it makes sense that we started seeing a little bit of an addiction rise.
Sure. This abundant availability of powerful drugs led to what some describe as the quote-unquote first opioid crisis. In the 1880s, addiction began to increase with an estimated as much as 1 in 200 Americans addicted to opiates. Most of these reporting addiction were women, which was 60%, and then white, middle to upper class people. So it's kind of always, I think, been a drug of the classes, if you will.
Yeah.
But yes, so that's how it actually originally began. And as I said, it was not uncommon for spouses to go to a doctor and say, my wife is being hysterical, or I can't control her, or whatever. And then the doctor would give them laudanum that they would simply administer their wives. And that would be a way that people dealt with it. And I think that the problems with that should be abundantly clear just by the way that I'm talking about it, I hope. But if not, then let me put it in this phrasing. That's terrible.
Yeah, for folks who did not get that. Yeah, it's a real problem. I want to point out too, and I want to be really clear about this, and I'm so glad that we did talk about this. Most of those reporting addiction were women, were also white folks, and we're also middle to upper class folks. That is going to be a narrative that's going to come up as we talk about the war on drugs and where it goes later and some of the concerns with that. So city and state regulations began to take hold and restrict prescriptions and access to opioid products, around this quote unquote opioid crisis. So for instance, Pennsylvania passed an anti-opioid law as early as 1860. 1875 saw San Francisco begin to push fines and jail time for visiting opioid dens. And there's no way that could be racist, right? Like, there's no way that any of that could be racist. That's a drug problem, right?
Yeah, I mean, how could it be, really? It's just talking about these drugs. So let's just read this quote here that I think really shows how not racist it is. Quote, many women and young girls, as well as young men of respectable family, were being induced to visit Chinese opium smoking dens where they were ruined morally and otherwise, end quote. Ooh.
Huh. That took a turn.
Whoops.
Maybe while we digest that, it's probably worth taking a break because, surprise, racism is here.
And once again, whoops. Back from the hopefully not racist ads, who knows? Hard to escape, I think, sometimes, particularly in a... Never mind. Let's move on. So at the time, there was this major anti-Chinese sentiment because many Americans started believing that it was Chinese immigrants were coming to the United States and taking their jobs. Good Lord, history repeats itself.
It's just some things never change, unfortunately. I know. This led to the Congress at the time passing the Chinese Exclusion Act. Just to be clear, this act was called the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which actually effectively reduced Chinese labor immigration and prevented those pesky workers from coming in and taking the jobs, whoever those workers were, coming in and taking their jobs that only Americans really wanted, right?
Yeah.
You can't see my eye roll, but I imagine you can hear it at least because, again, this is just 2024, but with like steam trains.
Steampunk 2024.
Oh, no.
Oh, man. That is, we've never escaped it. It's just kind of always here, always been the thing.
We're number one.
Yeah. The name of this was in 1882. In 1909, the Smoking Opium Exclusion Act was passed, which prohibited opium from anything other than medicinal purposes and put a federal ban on recreational use. And this was followed by the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act in 1914, which aimed to regulate opium and coca-derived products as well. And I think I don't remember if this is the one that had something to do also with like transporting them or sending them via the postal service or something. But there's a whole sort of slew of these that were all very directly targeted at that population specifically out of fear mongering more than any actual practical concern over like what was going on.
Right. You start kind of seeing at this point in time, they're trying to tamp down on the use of any of these drugs. But then what happens? World War I. And as you can imagine, the use of opium led to many soldiers becoming addicted. Same with the Civil War. It was used in battlefield treatments. And this actually led to an international focus on creating drug control treaties and policies. So you saw kind of after World War I, there was a big movement towards international collaboration around enforcing and treating and addressing drug-related issues.
So we've basically got this, we have now a history of establishing criminalization of these different substances. That seems to be working great. So in 1919, the U.S. passes the 18th Amendment, which is where we get prohibition. Yay. This was another example of like criminalizing illicit substance use. The National Prohibition Act, or the Volstead Act, was put into place to federally ban alcohol. And so like, right, gangbusters totally worked. Nobody drinks now, right? Right?
Right. Yeah. I can't imagine a lot of cities ended up with a really powerful mafia base as a result of bootlegging and speakeasies and all the fun stuff that goes along with prohibition. But that's a conversation for a different day. Maybe we'll just do prohibition and talking about how abstinence doesn't work. I don't know. That'd be a fun episode.
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. All right. So in 1930, it was deemed an unequivocal failure, prohibition, and was eventually repealed with the 21st Amendment. What happened to make them change their minds? Well, the Great Depression, for one, and international stressors that eventually led to World War II. So Great Depression, World War II, people can't drink, people are stressed out, and they were finding that it wasn't working for the country. So consumption actually didn't decrease either. Organized crime increased, and tax revenue related to alcohol sales were entirely lost. It was to put it lightly, a colossal failure. Like, it couldn't have been more of a failure.
It was basically like, it was this moral crusade with zero thought put into it. Of like, of what's going to happen when we suddenly just change this part of like people's lives that's so readily available already. Like, how do we roll this out? What does enforcement look like? And like, it was just moral panic, moral outrage, put into federal law, and let's call it liberty, right? Like, that's been such a thing for so long. Anyway, just huge disaster. Then not uncommon, and not the last time that it will happen either. As obviously, I mean, we're going through history right now. We're leading up to the stuff. So
yeah, it's a mess.
We won't bore you with more details on all the things that keep coming up to the war. But in the time between 1930 and 1970s, we did see some major events that are worth at least enumerating real quickly.
Yeah, so in 1930, there was a development of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. And then in 1935, FDR decided that narcotics were worse than we thought and decided to put some acts and extended some acts in place to allow state seizure of drugs and to impart penalties on those in possession of illegal drugs. This in particular is a hugely important step in this history.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like it. As soon as essentially every time they sort of increase the government's power to try to regulate this stuff and enforce criminalization of these things. In 1944, the LaGuardia Committee determined that cannabis wasn't bad at all and contradicted government claims to the contrary. So that led to the widespread availability of cannabis because the government listened to their professional opinions. Wait, that's not what happened. The U.S. government completely ignored them.
Oh, no. Yeah, they completely ignored him, didn't do anything with it, and just brushed it under the rug. Now, in the 1950s, there were major movements to begin banning drugs due to, quote, white suburban grassroots movements, end quote, and they actually cited worries about teenagers getting pulled into drug use. So several acts were passed in relation to that. Now, again, white suburban grassroots movements. Any implications? Any concerns with that statement? I would imagine that y'all are probably gleaning the same things that we're gleaning here, but yeah, probably not great.
Also, cited worries about is very different than cited evidence of.
Yes.
So that is fear-mongering 101 right there. In 1961, the UN comes together for the United Nations Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. This was a treaty ratified in 1967 that aimed to regulate and punish drug production and trafficking internationally. So we have a whole worldwide coalition of attempting to criminalize drugs.
Yeah, I wonder how much of that was brought on by the fact that people just didn't like hippies.
Not zero amount of it.
Somebody was like, ooh, I hate hippies. These heshers. Somebody like right before Woodstock had seen like, I don't know, Jimi Hendrix or the Doors and was like, I hate this, and tried to get rid of all of it.
That was it.
Maybe the villain from, from Dirty Dancing. All right, so this brings us to 1970. Richard Nixon signs the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act, which is just rolls off the tongue. This is going to go back to the episode that we talked about on tough on crime. So Nixon had a tough on crime type of mentality when it came to drugs, and he decided to go after drugs and all this stuff just really, really hard. But what did this act do? First, it made simple possession a felony. So it criminalized any illegal drug at a very high level.
Right.
Which that means, like, you know, in the United States, a lot of times felons can't even vote. So I want you to start seeing kind of a thread emerge as we kind of talk about this.
And there's an aspect of this that is worth considering of what was defined as a drug. And there's sort of these classes of substances and what substances fell into those classes. And cannabis, marijuana, is one of those. Like having a blade of a leaf of a cannabis plant could end you in prison and remove your right to vote.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another part of this policy is that first offenses carried a maximum of 1 year in prison. So again, they wanted really harsh sentencing for minor nonviolent crimes, and penalties for trafficking drugs included imprisonment for life.
Yeah, so talk about harsh. Funding was provided to the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare for treatment, rehab, and education. So there was at least some funding going to those spaces.
Would you pronounce the acronym of Department of Health, Education, and Welfare as DEW?
Oh yeah, I absolutely would.
Mountain Dew, or why we do what we
do. Mountain Dew.
Do. There were no knock powers granted to federal drug agents, meaning that they could simply enter a place without any warning. We've definitely seen how well that has gone in recent years, with many people dying unnecessarily when police have raided the wrong houses, scared the crap out of occupants who then fired at the police thinking that their house was being broken into. And God, it's so complicated. Like, everybody has drugs. Everybody's entering people's homes. What a disaster this is. Yeah. Somebody thought this was a good idea somewhere along the line. Anyway, it's at least partially started in 1970.
They also started, as part of this act, started looking at record keeping. So they started looking at doing a better job reporting and record keeping for controlled substances as defined by the government, what can be considered scheduled drugs, like scheduled class drugs and all that. So all of that is now in place. You've got harsher penalties. You've got more documentation around stuff. You've got some funding somewhere, but you've got these really, really intense penalties for any possession, any trafficking, anything at all. I mean, you're talking anywhere between up to a year to life in prison for any of these charges.
Now, without being so incredibly smug and sarcastic about it, you can imagine that essentially the intention of this was to make it so that the penalization for anything drug related was so severe that people would then make the choice not to engage in those drug related activities. It would at least reduce the number of people and the amount and the extent to which this was happening. So I think that then is coming at this from the perspective of understanding humans do a thing. The only way we know how to control what they're doing is to punish the crap out of their behavior.
Right.
And we're going to use the biggest, heaviest, most nail-laden bat that we can find. And we're going to use that to enforce as our punisher to try and change this behavior that's happening. So that's essentially the kind of philosophy that is brought to this. Humans do bad or thing that we are calling bad. The only way to change the thing that we're calling bad is to punish them as severely as we possibly can. That's essentially the mentality of this.
Right.
So let the battle begin.
During the conflict in Vietnam, Morgan Murphy and Robert Steele, they visited soldiers and found an alarming rate of heroin addiction among military forces in the area. They brought this concern back to the U.S. and discussions around expanding anti-drug abuse measures began. And this is where we actually see the quote that brings us to the term, the war on drugs. And this is directly from Nixon. Nixon said, quote, "Present efforts to control drug abuse are not sufficient in themselves. The problem has assumed the dimensions of a national emergency. If we cannot destroy the drug menace in America, then it will surely in time destroy us." And so this quote kind of goes on. We'll kind of talk about that in a second, but he's kind of already kind of doing a little bit of fear mongering around this and saying, we can't destroy it. If we let it continue, it will destroy us. So we've got to get to them first.
And Nixon continued this messaging, eventually citing drugs as, quote, America's public enemy number one, end quote. a phrase that I think will eventually be adopted almost as a badge of honor for some people.
Yeah.
In the same news conference, he went on to say, quote, "In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive," end quote. He had, at this point, declared war on drugs.
Oh, man. And, I think this is a huge turning point for this entire thing. And just, we've already kind of talked about some of the problems with the legal aspects of this, the acts that are developed, we haven't even really talked about how it's impacting communities, but we've kind of talked about how this has shaped up over the course of almost 100 years at this point in time. By the time Nixon shows up, this has been something that has been a present worry in the U.S. for at least 100 years, right? So,
sure.
So at this point in time, this is just somebody who's taking an age-old issue and turning it into a much bigger issue. But one of the age-old issues that we often face, especially in this world that we're dealing with in current 2024, is marketing and ads. So we got to deal with that for a second.
Okay, so what we've been talking about now is Nixon is declaring an all-out offensive on drugs, citing, I think, essentially the use of heroin in the military and particularly during the Vietnam War as a reason that this is going to destroy our country if we don't declare war on this thing. And so there was some fallout, more or less, or maybe a better way to say that is this kickstarted several programs, many of which are still around today, and even departments. And one of those is the creation of the Office of Drug Abuse Law Enforcement and the Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA, through specifically executive presidential orders.
Yeah. And now when Reagan took office, Ronald Reagan, he actually pushed for an increase in the focus on this war. He said, quote, "We're taking down the surrender flag that has flown over so many drug efforts. We're running up a battle flag." So he's kind of reinforcing that idea of like, this is an actual war and we're going to take the offensive at this point in time and we're going to attack these problems.
Now, and we'll get into this either in this episode or another or both, but there are some data on like drug overdose deaths and use that we'll see what the before and after timeline looks like as a part of these efforts. I don't want to spoil it too much, but let's suffice it to say it didn't necessarily go the way that they were thinking it was going to.
No, not even close.
So under the Reagan administration, again, this is Ronald Reagan, who I believe was elected in 81, took office in 82, or he was elected in 82, took office in 83. Either way, he was the president for the vast majority of the 80s, all the way up until 1988, when George W. H.
Right,
Walker,
which would have been George
Walker Bush.
George
yeah.
H.W., yeah. The one that threw up on the ambassador.
Yeah.
And got beat up by Homer Simpson.
I think it was 81 to 88 then that he was the president. And anyway, under his administration, there was a push to increase the budget to fight this epidemic of drugs to $95 million in the year 1984. And this involving the CIA and U.S. military interventions.
So just to be clear, there was a push to increase budgets on drug enforcement programs that included military involvement. And what you saw was military involvement inside of drug-addled communities.
Right. So
like you saw military involvement show up in cities where drug use was cited as a major concern. But yeah. Let's talk about this even further. So in 1984, Reagan signs the Comprehensive Crime Control Act. This allows even harsher penalties for cannabis, already more like harsher than they already were back when it was signed in the 1970s. This act allowed for the seizure of assets as part of penalties. And so any proceeds from gained assets were shared among agencies. So that doesn't sound like a bad thing, right? Break the law, lose your stuff, right? That kind of makes sense. But as of 2019, $36.5 billion worth of assets have been seized and reallocated into agency budgets. Here's what this means. This means that when somebody in the community, somewhere in the community, when some government agency intervenes and they intervene based on some drug charges and they seize whatever properties as a result of those related crimes, whatever properties, whatever assets they seize can go and be sold, and that money just goes right back into government funding. So let's say you had a car that you were using to traffic drugs. Well, you get in trouble, you get charged, they take your car, they sell your car, that money goes back into the budget of the people that just arrested you, and they get that money. They get that tens of thousands of dollars or however much it cost, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. Does anybody see any sort of like conflict of interest in that? maybe some problems with that. I can imagine there's some issues.
Yeah, there's a big incentive now for essentially anybody who's doing any kind of enforcement to go after everyone, particularly if there's money involved. Now, important caveat, though, there are laws and there are people who are protected by those laws. So people who are particularly wealthy, even if they may have access to and use a lot of drugs, also have access to and use a lot of lawyers.
Yes.
And so it's actually harder to go after the bigger fish who will have more assets that can be seized because they are so well protected. And so it's easier to go for a bunch of little seizures of assets from small defenseless people who may not have very much, but also aren't going to put up much of a fight, than it is to go after the big ones that are going to put up a lot of a fight and who you may not actually be able to get anything from and even potentially lose money to.
Right.
So they've really stacked the incentives in a way that's likely to result in a lot of targeting people who don't have a lot to lose to begin with. And we'll get more to that in unpacking how this all played out.
Right. Another part of this kind of campaign and this war on drugs, we started to see Just Say No. Anybody who's our age is familiar with Just Say No. It's all about peer pressure, right?
Yeah.
Just Say No is a public campaign aimed at youth as part of drug resistance programs. And the idea was that you didn't need to succumb to peer pressure. When you get offered, you, quote, just say no. I've said yes to so many things. This did not work.
Yeah. I mean, again, this is just, such a fundamental misunderstanding of behavior and circumstances.
Yeah.
It's like not thinking at all about any part of the process that has someone make that choice. And it was like, doesn't matter at all. Doesn't matter how you got there. Doesn't matter what the reinforcing consequences are. All that matters is that you have something that you can do and that the government tells you that it's a thing that you should do. And that should be enough. And I'm like, God, in what fantasy world do you live?
Yeah.
So this is essentially a marketing campaign, right? This is like, we're going to try and push this easy slogan as part of our thing. And so the propaganda starts. As part of the ongoing initiatives to scare the shit out of everyone, there began to be this narrative that focused on the increased use of one specific drug, the archetype of all bad things. Because even though heroin kicked this off, crack cocaine is where this really shifted. So the stories of crackheads began to show up in the media per the direction of the Reagan administration, who knowingly played up the harmful effects of the drug, really emphasizing here are all of the major downsides. And crack was even declared the issue of the year as part of this propaganda media campaign. So it was this very one-sided, and not to say that like we need to really extol the meritorious delights of cocaine in any way, but I think it whenever you're doing some kind of informational campaign, what we have seen time and time again, and this was actually part of the lesson learned, was their propaganda here, is that lying backfires badly.
Yes.
Right? Like you need to be factual. If you portray misinformation, people figure that out.
Right.
Like it's not that hard.
Right.
And so if you try and lie, then pretty much your entire message gets dismantled. And they were so hell-bent on the destruction of cocaine as like, and honestly, you could throw cannabis in there too, but I mean, cocaine was really their primary target. The worst possible thing that you could do that, like, I think that it became kind of transparent that it was almost like you don't know what you're talking about.
Right. Another important note inside of this, there are lots and lots and lots of discussions about how the DEA and the CIA were both involved in introducing crack cocaine into majority black communities. Like that was something that they actively had programs around and did. And there were talks of government alliances with CIA, which has a history of destabilizing other government bodies. So the CIA in themselves has already done some shady shadow work. Like, and that's all documented. That's not me getting on my conspiracy theory high horse or anything like that. I just want to be clear. Like there's evidence and released documents of the CIA doing these types of things. It's been found time and time again that the CIA has directly conducted drug trafficking operations or been complicit in the act of procuring and distributing potent drugs into specific communities. That is documented. So weird. The war on drugs does more racism. Who would have thought?
Yes. And I mean, this is not this is still a basic tactic that's used today. It is to they will seed the field with the components of a problem so that they can fuel outrage to get people behind their problem. Right.
Yeah.
We just saw this play out in the United States, who they were passing the toughest, most severe immigration reform laws that they had ever passed. The bill was introduced. Both parties were willing to sign it. And the bill died because they realized they could use this as a political issue to try and get more of their officials elected by fear mongering on the issues of immigration. And so they were like, we want this problem to continue so that we can use your outrage to gain votes and stay in power. That's their tactic. And they did the same thing here with this war on drugs thing. And so the war raged on. But what of the impact? So here are a few other things that we should note. The American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, wrote a report called, quote, "The Drug War is the New Jim Crow," end quote. What they found is that the U.S. black incarceration rates were vastly disproportionate compared to white drug crimes. States back this up currently. Black Americans are 13.4 times more likely to be arrested and incarcerated than white Americans. And that's, you control for the fact that you're looking at what is the representative sample of people who are in this population, and you look at the same exact type of crimes they're being prosecuted for, and people who are black are being arrested more often and prosecuted more often, even if you have people who are doing the same things with the same drugs who are white. So they're getting lower sentences or none at all if they're white, and they're getting harsher sentences and longer for smaller offenses if they're a black. And that's also been very well established in the research at this point.
Right, absolutely. So some other things, drug charges can result in the loss of someone's right to vote, custody of their children, and seizure of personal property. We kind of established a couple of those things. But the 2000 annual drug control budget for the year 2000 in the United States was $18.4 billion, half of which was spent just on law enforcement. So we're spending a lot of money every year to fight something that's not really working.
Now, I think it's fairly clear we tend to have a slightly left of center leaning political orientation on this show. But here's, I think, the position that I've always will and always have taken is that of like the scientific position, right? And there are plenty of times that like Democrats do the thing that is not, or the left leaning folks, whoever they are, do the thing that is not the science informed position. And so the Obama administration implemented a variation of this very same approach called tough but smart. And so it's important to highlight the differences between the sort of tough on crime, war on drugs, and the tough but smart view. So here, we'll go through the list really quick. That's the list. All they did was stop calling it
That was great. I love that. Thank you for that.
I'm glad. All they did was stop calling it the war on drugs, and they just felt that that was a productive way to do it. But it was really the same failed policies that had been in place all along.
Yeah, I mean, I think the closest they did, there was one small change, and it was under the Affordable Health Care Act, and that actually increased access to drug treatment programs. Now, that's not to say that those drug treatment programs were all super effective or super useful or anything like that, but there is at least access, which I think is an overall net gain compared to any other administration that's been working on this. I think that that's a start in the right direction.
That's true.
But that's really the only thing that happened under the Obama administration.
Yeah, that's fair. And that's true. So I think, perfectly happy to be critical of anybody who does stupid things. That was a stupid thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. But again, what it comes down to overall, and as I've said, the scientific view is like, did it work? What's the effect? If it was the case that we declare a war on drugs and the overall effect is we have fewer people die, that by itself is victory enough to say, all right, there's something to this here. We have fewer people die, fewer people are using drugs, we have less crime. All of that would imply that we have a successful program. Any one of those would be good factors. But honestly, like I said, if you just had fewer deaths, that would be good enough for me to say victory, we have a successful policy here.
Right. And you're going to find out that that's not what happened. Not only did we have just as many, if not more deaths, we also had the issue of a higher incarceration rate than we have ever had in the history of the United States. So none of it worked. And as a matter of fact, in 2011, the Global Commission on Drug Policy, which was a third-party group comprised of former government officials, released their report updating the world on the status of the war on drugs. And you know what they said? The global war on drugs has failed.
So over the past 2 administrations in the United States, new laws have been passed to begin to undo some of the damage that was done over the years. They decided to start with cannabis, the federal decriminalization, approval of medicinal cannabis access, and reinvestment of impacted communities. And that's at least with just that. And that is one of the more commonly used of all of the substances, but just weed.
Yeah, that's it. That's really the biggest change that's happened so far in repairing all the damage that was done. There are some states that have decriminalized all drugs, and we'll talk about a little bit about that too. But let's talk about how this impacts the U.S. specifically. So drug offenses are the leading cause of arrest in the U.S., with nearly 1 million arrests per year.
Wow.
These arrests are often impactful for Black, Latino, and Indigenous people, as well as low-income homes. So the majority of people that get arrested for drug-related charges are usually people of color or people of low socioeconomic status.
I know that we've talked about this before, and it's not worth getting on the soapbox here, but I think always thinking about what is the point of imprisonment? Are we looking at retribution? Is it from a safety angle? Like, what are we trying to do here? And I really have always seen it as as it having a function of safety. Like there are certain people who, whatever has had them arrive at the place that they're at, we don't know that we can effectively prevent them from doing more harm.
Right.
With non-violent crimes like drug use and possession, they weren't doing any harm. It just seems like a totally unnecessary use of our time and resources to prosecute that to the point of imprisonment. But we'll get to that in another discussion.
Right.
Another thing that's like absurd about this is that not only is this something that I think you could quite easily argue should not result in incarceration, but right now, 1 in 5 incarcerations out of nearly 2 million are arrested for drug offenses. Like 20% of people who are incarcerated are in there for drug-related offenses.
Right. And the majority of them are for cannabis. So like, it's not even like a lot of the other things. So which, I can go down the street and go buy weed now legally.
Yeah.
But there's people in jail for it. So that is an absurd thing. Now, another thing that's important to note, and I think this is a very real thing, but we will talk about this as we kind of unpack statistics and stuff around this type of thing. Fatal overdoses have increased to over 600% or by over 600% between 2001 and 2018. So there is an increase in use and health adverse conditions, death being one of those health adverse conditions. This is kind of starting to increase over time. Now, how much of that is actually attributed to the drug of choice or some other medical condition, that's worth unpacking from a statistical standpoint. But we are seeing an increase in drug-related deaths over this time.
And we'll actually be talking very soon, I think actually in the next episode, about wasn't going to give it away, but I'll just say on harm reduction specifically. And in looking at some of the numbers, 600% is on the very, very, very low end of how much of an increase we've seen. It is actually, and up to 2021, it is risen even considerably over that. So there's a lot that's happening right there. The current budget for the war on drugs is $47 billion now. The DEA alone costs $3.3 billion to operate annually. So when people are looking for all the ways that the government spends taxpayer money on things that maybe they feel are not necessary to the functioning of a healthy society, this is one place I think we could certainly aim our sights at and say, do we need this much though?
Right. Yeah, it's a lot. Another thing, too, that I found really interesting as we were doing this one is that drug offenses were actually the second most common cause of deportation. First being illegal entry in 2019, but the second most common cause of deportation is drug-related offenses, possession, trafficking, distribution, stuff like that.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. There's a really interesting study from Cohen et al. In 2020, and they showed that despite the overall impact of the war on drugs, systems and kind of like undoing some of that stuff, things like the Just Say No policy and all that stuff, like when they started doing all that, systems still enact really problematic policies. So employment, education, housing, public benefits, family regulations, drug treatment systems, and healthcare systems all have very strict anti-drug policies, even with kind of rolling back and decriminalizing some of those things on the federal level. So these policies can actually result in lifetime barriers for someone for simple possession. So for example, like if I were somebody who wanted to actually, I can use the example of my job now. So the place I work at is really great, but if, I had a charge, let's say I had like a drug possession charge on my background screening, I wouldn't be able to work and bill for services on Medicaid because there are some restrictions to being able to work on federal programs with background screenings that have criminal, like a felony on that background screening.
Wow.
And that might have happened. I could have done that when I was 21 and I'm 38 now, and that would still follow me. I would have to work and do all the legal kind of mumbo jumbo to like undo that, to get that away and to be able to work on those funding sources. So like these types of things can have long lasting effects for families and for people without even just for something as simple as having too much weed on me.
Well, let's transition to something that hopefully has short-term lasting effects and then is rapidly out of your system, and that is the ads. Okay, so getting back to our topic here in terms of what is the actual sort of science here, and I think you could think about this as historically, what has happened, where has it got us, and what can we do about it now? And I think in reflecting on where the drug wars have gotten us, I think the original aim was, even in its inception, like the development of this was myopic at best. The goal was to reduce or remove opportunity, but it didn't actually at all think about the complex systems in which drug use existed, particularly in the early iterations of this. Like they were really, really silly. And then they started to put in policies where they did start to think through, I believe anyway, the different sort of parts of the system and levels where drug exist, but they still weren't thinking about some of the most important parts, which are why are people choosing to use drugs in the first place? And like, what could we do to help them make different choices besides a stupid poster that says, just say no, right?
Right.
Anyway, so that's I think where it sort of started and where it sort of got us.
Right. And as we kind of look at some of these issues too, social issues, just like minority groups and situations like that, folks who self-medicate for mental health concerns, in poverty specifically, like we see these types of situations. Minority groups, mental health, poverty are often reporting more drug-related crimes. Crimes then remain with that person, and ultimately what ends up happening is it produces limited opportunities for work and ultimately maintains poverty systems. So this issue of this tough on drugs type of policy ends up really only impacting the folks that are in systems that kind of perpetuate that issue. So you want to fight the war on poverty? Then here's a great way to do it. Decriminalize drugs and take those off people's records and let them vote, because I can guarantee you right now you would have an entirely different outcome if you could allow people to participate in the systems in which they are being incarcerated in. So, you have this like huge issue where the folks that are being targeted are disproportionately targeted compared to folks that have money or, are white, we'll say. Those are huge problems.
And I think there does need to be, there's a lot of strategic support that I think needs to be put in place, because what we have seen is simple decriminalization. There's been some caveats to that I think we'll need to unpack probably in another discussion.
Right.
But looking at decriminalization, harm reduction policies, and comprehensive treatment programs, they've fared a lot better at addressing the issue with drugs than simply abstinent-based education systems such as DARE, and certainly more than harsh penalties have ever done to try and combat the issue that can come with addiction thing. Because I think one of the things, that people have always said is they're like, well, we don't want to make cannabis legal because you don't want like your surgeon like getting high before they go into the surgery, or your pilot getting high before flying a plane. I'm like, do you think that they were just like on the edge waiting, like, I can't wait till they legalize weed so they can get high and then fly this plane? I'm like, let's look at you. I'm like, you, the politician, is like the only reason you're not hopelessly addicted to something is because it's currently illegal. You're like, I would be smoking marijuana all day, every day, but it's illegal. And I'm a law abiding citizen. Therefore I will not use. I'm like, nobody is like that.
There are so few people that are that rule governed.
Exactly. That I'm like, in these systems, the people who are like going to use drugs, they find a way. Otherwise, we wouldn't have to like deal with this, right?
Right.
And it's like, otherwise, the systems would work perfectly. So like, just making it legal doesn't mean that, or making it not criminalized at least, doesn't mean that you should expect a huge spike in use of this, because so few people are holding out on it because it's illegal,
Right.
And there is more to unpack in that we'll get to in a minute, but I just feel like it's worth pointing that out.
as somebody who has a medical card, I think about this and I think like, okay, so let's say Florida decriminalized all drugs. There's not a part of me that goes, oh, good, it's legal now. Let me go do heroin.
Right.
Like I have no interest in doing that.
Yeah.
Right. But people who are interested in doing heroin are going to go do heroin, whether it's legal or not. Yeah. So like, it doesn't make any sense. It's ridiculous. Okay. Anyway, so let's talk about, I think, the simple behavioral science perspective. We already know that addressing behavior on this like fundamental functional level, on the outcomes based level, is far more effective than punishing it. Teaching somebody what to do instead of doing the problem is way better than punishing the problem by itself. If we can give an equivalent or closely related alternative skill, that organism, that person is more likely to maintain skills in that teaching and beyond the teaching context in which we've taught them. So we teach them to do something better and they're more likely to do that by going forward. But if we punish that behavior, all we're doing is creating a context in which there is one, an alternative that hasn't been learned, which has created in itself a behavior vacuum, right? So we've taken away a behavior or tried to take away a behavior, but now we've left this gap where a behavior doesn't exist. And two, the person develops a healthy dislike for whoever is punishing them. So they're going to spend a lot of time in counter coercion and counter control, fighting back against the system that's punishing them. So it makes sense that, you know, you're going to have a hard time with some folks who are incarcerated. Why would they treat you nice when you're punishing them for no reason, or at least for some silly reasons? So I think it's important just to know that like it is always better to teach something to do instead than it would ever be to just punish a behavior forever.
Yes. And I do think a lot of people are going to hear this and say like, yeah, but, and they'll have a list of things. And some of those things include that like, we're not advocating that we should have no systems to try and decrease the use of drugs.
Right.
I think that we are actually advocating strongly the opposite. I think we need systems to address the use of drugs and other illicit substances, particularly before they become a dependency and particularly before they cause death.
Yes.
To do that, what we need to do is consider what are the circumstances under which someone makes that choice in the first place, and can we get to them there at that point before they've ever made the leap? And if they're at a point where they're choosing drugs because they're trying to mitigate pain, then we need a better healthcare infrastructure to ensure that they can get treatment for their pain in a way that does not result in them choosing that as their alternative. That is affordable, it's accessible, and that they know how to get it and use it reliably, and also like probably treat whatever condition is causing them chronic pain.
Right.
If they're using it because of like peer pressure or these social groups, and particularly I think of like drug cartels, then like what we need is we need better systems where we need whistleblower laws to protect them. We need places where people can shelter and support, and ways that we can educate the community to help them be able to fight against that. And I think we do need to be on the lookout for people who come into the country with that intention. And like, again, a yeah, but that I hear is like, let's look at, I was seeing a news report about this. It's either Montana or Wyoming. I want to say it's Montana. There's an indigenous reservation there of American Native people. It has like more fentanyl than the rest of the state put together. And it's way up in Montana. And there's essentially a few reasons for this. One of them is that the native indigenous peoples have been so stripped of their power to do any kind of regulating and enforcement of their borders, of their people, of the laws inside of them, and from getting any kind of help from the government, that they are way understaffed to combat the problem.
Right.
A second reason is that what has happened is they can sell fentanyl for way more than it's worth the further they have to go from the border to get there. And so it's created a sort of market vacuum in a place with little oversight or regulation.
Right.
I think a third reason is because that they are able to push fentanyl in a way that like often people are sort of forced to even become addicted to it almost, or like a lot of peer pressure with these social campaigns that have essentially nothing combating them. Like it is open season for cartels to send people to this reservation. And that does actually filter out into the rest of the state to some point. And so like fentanyl, I think being one of the ones that people are most worried about. And this is the reason that we actually saw the state of Oregon is reversing its decriminalization of drugs. And it's because there's been a massive increase in overdose deaths almost exclusively due to fentanyl. But there was a huge unpacking that like what happened was when they voted to decriminalize those drugs, that was the only piece of the infrastructure they had ready to go. That slammed into place immediately. It took almost a year for them to get any of the other mental health counseling support systems up and ready to go to support that transition. All the other systems that needed to go in place to ensure that they could get people safely transitioning were not ready to go when decriminalization went into effect.
Right.
So it was just like really poor planning and execution. And on top of that, you have this like the fentanyl that's getting into the country, the synthetic opioid that is extremely dangerous, that's essentially making it onto the streets, and the people, they don't have a way to even know if that's what they're getting. Most people, as far as I know, aren't making the choice to ingest that substance. So I think the yeah buts that are around this, understandable as they are rooted in the fact that we didn't have the comprehensive approach that we would have advocated for to ensure that we could mitigate the use of drugs and ensure that people are able to make those choices safely.
Yeah, I think you absolutely nailed it.
Every time I get on like this super long soapbox, I talk so long you'd think that I'm not even breathing.
I had that thought. I was worried.
Like he's turning blue in the face, but he just keeps going. Well, I'll stop and catch my breath and sadly let the advertisers do their thing. All right, let's finish up. You definitely need to take center stage here because if people keep listening to me, they're going to stop listening to our podcast. So here's some other interesting tidbits in Shane narration, which is better than Abraham narration.
For some tad points, in the 1890s, you could actually purchase a syringe and either cocaine or heroin from the Sears catalog. It was in the catalog that you could just order from.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty great. In 1915, the narrative around drug use focused on black communities and how drugs resulted in superpowers for people who use them. And this was actually a thing that led to things like, yeah, great, right? And the New York Times was actually one of the major publishers writing about users in black communities who were using drugs and gaining superpowers as a result of that.
Cool.
All right, up until this point, the U.S. government has spent at least $1 trillion on the war on drugs and drug-related policies for it not to work. So there's that.
That's a lot.
That's so much money. 80% of opioids globally produced are consumed by Americans.
Wow.
So
that's impressive.
I know. We're number one. Legalizing cannabis could save the United States $7.7 billion a year for law enforcement costs and reduce the prison population by nearly half.
Wow. That would reduce by several more $1 billion. And in addition, I think would just overall reduce the rates of crime.
Yeah.
And they would be presumably earning tax money for this that would actually help cover some of the deficit that exists in the first place.
Right. Exactly. It's absurd that why they don't consider that. But, it's a moral issue. It's a moral fight. The war on drugs is a moral fight. It was never a statistics battle. It was never research.
That is money that cannot be unspent.
Right. Exactly.
Oh, my God.
What a mess.
Yeah. Okay, so that was the war on drugs. I think the take home of this is that it has been a colossal failure. It has been a failure by pretty every metric you could use to call it a failure. We've had more overdose deaths than ever following the war of drugs. We have the highest incarceration rates, I believe, of any democratized country in the whole world and throughout all of history. We spend the most money of this and still have some of the highest consumption rates. We have had high rates of use. We've had huge amounts of racism and disproportionate inequities created. Like this, I think, could tangentially be linked to things like the housing crisis, to unemployment, to homelessness. There is a wide-ranging list of effects that could be tied in one way or another to these failed policies that have done nothing. Like, you might be hearing this and thinking, like, why are we still doing this? The reason is there is still an enormous contingent of politicians who are pushing that addiction is a morality issue that is best addressed with punishment contingencies from the government. And that is the best and possibly only way to solve this issue is to continue to hit it harder. And they have convinced a large chunk of the American population that is so. And they are wrong. It is not so. It is not working. This has just been an utterly failed experiment in how to do, like, if there was a textbook on how to do things wrong, just like follow the history of the war on drugs.
Yeah.
Like, you could almost not have done it more wrong than they did. This is, I think, should be a wake-up call to the rest of us that, like, whatever direction we've taken on this so far, change course. Like, you almost couldn't make things worse than you have made them up to this point.
Right.
So, like, like anything else is better than this. It's hard to, like, you've basically opened a wound, filled it with like gangrenous bacteria, and then rubbed salt in it and just kept poking with sticks to make sure it stayed fresh. Like, literally anything you do at this point would be better. So I think there's a lot of things that we could do. And I think addressing, good scientists who understand how to leverage human psychology and behavior to put in policies that are most likely to result in effective changes is the best line of defense they could possibly have moving forward.
Yeah. I mean, I think the only take-home point I have at this point in time is, with all that information and everything that we've just talked about, drugs won.
Yeah,
that's what it is. I mean, that's what it is. Like, we lost the war on drugs. Drugs won, and it's because we didn't have a fundamental understanding of how any of it worked on a simple level.
Yeah,
and that's just what it came down to. We lost it.
The politicians failed this one because, like, psychologists knew for a long time that this was not going to work. And I think I've been beating that drum, particularly those of us in the sort of behavior science arena would have never advocated that this was the position that policies took. So, yeah, you're right. The final take home is that war on drugs, we lost, drugs won. Yep. If we was like the people on the other side of that war, I don't know.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. United States government lost. Absolutely.
Yep. Okay. Man, that was a lot to deal with. If you would like to tell us anything about the war on drugs, anything that we got wrong, that we got right, you would like to send us heaping amounts of praise, you should definitely do that. Reach out to us directly by emailing us at info@wwd.podcast.com. Leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts, like, subscribe, send this to a friend, etc. You can also join us on Patreon. We certainly appreciate all the support that you would want to and would give us there. And the list of people who have already made that leap that we are just ever grateful to includes Mike M, Megan, Layla, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Joshua, Brad, Stephanie, Olivia, Brian, Ashley, Kiara, Christy, and Michelle. Thank you all so much.
Yeah, we love y'all.
Moment of silence for appreciation of those wonderful people. Okay, that was our moment. Before we move on, I'd also like to let everyone know, if you're joining us for the first time, thank you so much for being here. I hope you got something out of this episode. Please stick around for a moment because we're about to recommend some really fun things, and recommendations, they're just fun. You get to hear, like, I wonder what those people really enjoy, and we're going to tell you.
Yeah.
But I'd also like to thank my team of people because writing and fact checking come from Shane and myself. And Shane, thank you so much for recording with me today, and specifically for putting together this fantastic episode that we just recorded.
Anytime. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. My pleasure. And also, the person who helps put this audio into a string of sounds that are worth listening to and works his editing magic is Justin Greenhouse. Our social media coordinator is Emma Wilson, with whom you will be speaking if you contact us on social media, and she will sort of put us in touch with you. So she's our filter for the craziness that can sometimes happen when people use social media platforms. But we're on all of the normal ones. You can reach us there. But I think that is all that I have. Is there anything that I missed or anything you'd like to add before we recommend some things?
Not on my end.
All right, then let's get to some recommendations.
Recommendations.
All right, so I'm going to recommend something that I don't normally do. This year, I've been trying to say yes to more things, and I decided to say yes to this thing. And I went to a local farm, and it's called Amberbrook Farms, and it's in Eustis, Florida. Do you know where Eustis is? I don't either, so it's fine.
No.
So Eustis is somewhere in the middle of the state. There are probably like 15 people that live there, but it's beautiful because the drive out there is very old Florida. So it's like Spanish moss, big oak trees, a lot of bodies of water that are definitely full of deadly alligators and stuff. So the reason we went out to this farm is because they were doing their annual blueberry festival, Easter celebration type of thing. And so blueberries are coming into season, strawberries are going out of season, and you go, and it's like kind of a you pick farm. You can go and pick the berries and the strawberries, and you can go get some onions if you want, and there's sunflowers. Well, they did this big Easter thing, and they had food trucks out there, and they had a candy cannon, which, they fired hard candy into the sky and let it rain down on kids, which is such a bad idea.
That's so Florida.
Yeah. They had, some slides on the property. They had ice cream. It was just a really great time. And I got to spend a few hours out there just kind of grabbing some blueberries. And I had some of the blueberries this morning and they were delicious. So strong recommend. If you like something that's like fun and kind of like an easy, carefree day, it's a beautiful way to go.
Wow, that's amazing. Blueberries have got to be one of my most favorite of all things. So,
because they're the best.
They're so good. I mean, just right off the bush, I can't even imagine something so wonderful. All right, Amber Brook Farms. That was a high sell. That makes me want to go to Florida right now just to enjoy the wonder that is.
I'll go with you.
Described.
Let's go.
That sounds really good. Okay, I'm recommending an app that I discovered recently. I like to read a lot, and I also am extremely busy, and I have a hard time reading, but I spend a lot of time doing something that involves my eyes, but does not necessarily involve my ears. A lot of sitting in traffic, a lot of like doing chores, sometimes exercising. And so what I was conflicted by is I couldn't read articles while I did those things. And so I would choose to read articles instead, or books or whatever. And I found this app that's called Speechify. And it is a definitely hardcore freemium app. It will not do very much if you don't pay for it, but I don't pay for it and I still find it useful. If you do pay for it, you can have Snoop Dogg read articles to you. And that sounds amazing. So I am highly tempted to pay for it just for that. There's other voices. There's like Gwyneth Paltrow, but I mean, you're doing it for Snoop Dogg. Let's be real. So of
course.
Yeah. I would definitely pay for it just for that if I wasn't so cheap, but that is an option on there. Otherwise, you have the free version that just reads you in a sort of very computer robotic sounding voice that doesn't quite know how to articulate many words. I will say it's not good at reading articles, but it's better than not reading articles, for me at least.
Yeah.
So basically you download a PDF and it just literally reads all the text that's on that page, top to bottom. Many articles are published in columns. It will most of the time do those columns correctly, but sometimes it won't. But it will also like every time read the header, footer, and page numbers, and like every single reference that is referenced in there, and citation and footnotes. So it's a lot, but like I was able to get through like 6 articles in a day, and that was up from 0 that I would have gotten through if I hadn't been using this, because I wouldn't have had time to read, like sit down and actually read that many with my eyeballs. Yeah. So I have found it useful enough to want to recommend it to people who feel like they can tolerate a computer voice reading things badly at them to at least get through articles. So if that's a thing, check it out. It's possible that the sort of enhanced version does a better job at reading them correctly. I don't know. I haven't tried it, but again, it's Snoop Dogg. So what are you going to do? That's like your best option.
You're right. How can you complain?
Exactly. So anyway, that's Speechify. You recommended Amber Brook Farms. I think that's what we have. Is there anything else you'd like to add or anything I forgot before we say our goodbyes?
No, I think it covers it.
Thank you all so much for listening. We hope you'd continue to join us on our journey through the addiction sphere. We have at least a small handful of episodes lined up coming down the road for you. And I can think of 3 at the top of my head, but join us next time for harm reduction. But that's what we have. So this is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.